So our second line of defense is still considered part of our innate defenses. These are not specific. And these are basically chemicals that if a foreign organism makes it through your skin or surface barriers, you have some chemicals and some cells deeper in your body to help fight this foreign organism off. And so I have a list of all of these things that are considered part of your second line of defense. And I'm going to walk through each one of these. Okay, so we're going to start with phagocytes. Phagocytes are cells, right? Cyte means cell. Cells that do a really good job of phagocytizing or eating foreign organisms. So some examples of phagocytic cells are things like neutrophils. Remember, neutrophils are a type of white blood cell. And if you remember from chapter 17, never let monkeys eat bananas, never, and neutrophil, the most abundant of our white blood cells. The reason we have so many of these is because they usually die fighting infections. Okay? And typically, the minute they recognize something foreign, they will start gobbling it up. They'll become incredibly phagocytic on exposure to an infectious material or a foreign antigen. Other phagocytic cells are things like macrophages. Macrophages come from monocytes, another type of white blood cell. Remember, never let monkeys. This is another one of our white blood cells. And macrophages develop from these monocytes, and they are also incredibly phagocytic cells. Now, we have different kinds of macrophages in the body. Some are what are called free macrophages. These can sort of wander through tissue spaces. So any tissue in the body that's sort of a loose tissue, like loose connective tissues. So think about it. When you think back to your tissues chapter, when we talked about your skin, we talked about how you have epithelial tissue on the top. Underneath that in the dermis, you have an areolar connective tissue, which is a loose tissue. It's very spread out. You have a ton of macrophages wandering through that tissue space. That's everywhere on the surface of your body. It's right underneath your epidermis. Okay, so they wander through, and this is incorrect. It should not say alveolar. It should say areolar connective tissue, right? That's a type of loose connective tissue. Now, we also have some macrophages that are fixed, which means they stay in a very particular organ or tissue. They don't move around and wander through the tissue spaces. Examples of this is you have macrophages that live in the lungs. So you have some that are always in the alveoli of the lungs. And they are sort of like the lung trash cans. Their job is to gobble up things that make it all the way down into those air sacs. You have some that constantly stay in the liver. They never leave the liver. You have some that live in the brain, like microglia. They don't ever leave the brain. And so these are fixed macrophages. Now I want to walk you through a little bit on how phagocytosis works. How do cells phagocytize or gobble up something that doesn't belong? So the cell, the phagocytic cell, first has to adhere to the particle. Now, there are some foreign organisms that are able to evade adherence, and they do this with a capsule. It's almost like an invisibility cloak. They can hold it over themselves, they cover themselves in this capsule, and your phagocytic cells don't see them as foreign, okay? Now, your immune system has the ability to coat a foreign organism with something called opsonins, and I'll show you a picture of this in just a minute. Opsonins are basically handles. And so the term of covering this foreign organism with opsonins is called opsonization. And it literally means to make tasty. A phagocytic cell will then reach out with cytoplasmic extensions and grab onto one of those opsonins, those little handles, and pull it towards itself and engulf it into a vesicle called a phagosome. That vesicle is going to fuse with a lysosome. Remember, lyse means to break open, and we call that a phagolysosome. And the enzymes, those lysosomal enzymes, will digest whatever was just involved. So let me show you a picture of these 4 steps. Okay? So in this image, this big purple structure, that is our phagocytic cell. Those little green ones, those do not belong. Those are foreign organisms. Okay. So the first thing that has happened is your immune system has coated these foreign organisms with opsonins, little handles, make them tasty. We call that opsonization. You can see that giant phagocytic cell is sending out these big cytoplasmic extensions, and it's latching on to that foreign organism. It's latching onto that opsonin. Okay, so they're trying to keep the colors consistent here. So you can see the big purple phagocytic cell. It has pulled that foreign organism in. Okay, so you can see here it's pulling it in, and it's going to engulf it in a vesicle. So that's called the phagosome. Now, this foreign organism is still alive. It's basically now inside this giant phagocytic cell, inside a little vesicle. And so the only way to get rid of this is to actually add enzymes to it. So how does that happen? You see a lysosome, another vesicle that contains those lysosomal enzymes. And those two vesicles merge with each other. Think of like 2 bubbles that come together and make a bigger bubble. Okay. Now you can see all of those enzymes are now where all those foreign organisms are living. And we call that a phagolysosome. Those enzymes gobble up those foreign organisms. And now that debris can be released out of the cell through exocytosis. So basically that purple phagocytic cell brought in the foreign organism, merged some enzymes to it. The enzymes broke it down and it spit it out. So it literally brings it in, chews it up, spits it out. Okay. And now that foreign organism cannot run around the body causing havoc. It has been degraded. And so, like I mentioned, the lysosomal enzymes are really what are killing those pathogens. They are digesting, they're lysing open those foreign cells. Now, there are some foreign organisms, some pathogens, that have the ability to resist lysosomal enzymes. And a good example of that is tuberculosis. In this case, your immune system has to work a little bit harder. A type of lymphocyte called a helper T cell, which we'll talk about later on in the chapter, can actually help by releasing additional enzymes. So maybe in this case, lysosomal enzymes are not enough. So helper T cells will release more enzymes, which are called respiratory burst. The respiratory burst actually produces hydrogen peroxide, bleach, and it can help to kill off those foreign organisms in that way. It can change the pH, which can kill off foreign organisms. And it can also release free radicals, which can kill off those foreign organisms. Now, other than phagocytic cells, we also have natural killer cells. Natural killer cells are not phagocytic cells. Instead, these are lymphocytes, type of lymphocyte, and their job is they're going to attack any cell that does not have the cell surface receptor. So instead of having a self antigen, they have a foreign antigen. It does not belong. Oops. So that's what we mean when we say they lack the cell surface antigen. And so natural killer cells, these are going to induce cancer cells in the body or cells in your body that have been infected by a virus. It's going to cause them to go through apoptosis. That term just means cell death. You should have learned about that general biology and in Anatomy 1. The other thing that natural killer cells will do is they will secrete chemicals that enhances your inflammatory response, which is another one of our second lines of defense. Okay, so let's talk about this inflammatory response. This is going to get triggered anytime any tissue in your body is injured. And it's going to help to prevent any kind of toxins or damaging chemicals to be released from that area. The inflammatory response also helps to get rid of pathogens and any cell debris from damaged cells in your body. And it is also alerting your third line of defense, your adaptive immune system. So remember when I walked through our first, second, and third line of defense, and I told you that in reality, if something makes it through your first line of defense, the second and third line of defense are pretty much activated at the same time. This is why. The inflammatory response is so helpful in that when as soon as this is activated, it also activates your third line of defense. Okay, so they're activated at about the same time. This also is going to help to set the stage for repair. So what is the inflammatory response? The inflammatory response is when you damage your tissue, it gets red and it gets swollen and inflamed and it hurts. That's all part of the inflammatory response. So let's walk through each of the steps of the inflammatory response. Okay, so the first one is redness. So let's say you cut your skin. First thing that's going to happen is you've just cut through a ton of blood vessels. So you are bleeding into that area. So you're going to have a lot of redness in the area from all the extra blood flow. All the extra blood flow is going to bring a lot of heat with it as well. The tissues are going to start to increase their fluid, so they're going to start to swell, and swelling is going to push on nerves, and that is going to cause pain. Now the pain is actually kind of a good thing because it causes you to not move that area. It causes you or forces you to rest, and that helps with healing. So all of these steps go together. So let's walk through these in a little more detail. So the first thing that happens is, let's say you have damaged your skin or a tissue. The first thing is a chemical alarm gets released. This is coming from any injured cells or tissues. The chemical is getting squeezed into the extracellular fluid. This is your tissue fluid. This is chemicals that are coming not only from injured tissues, but it can even be coming from immune system cells or even blood proteins like histamine. Now, there are epithelial cells and macrophages that have something called toll-like receptors on them. These are also going to promote inflammation or the inflammatory response. Now, some different chemicals that are being released are things like thymus, prostaglandins, even complement proteins, which we'll talk more about. And again, the first thing that's going to happen is these chemicals, as soon as you've damaged your tissues and these chemicals get released, it's going to cause local arterioles to die. Make it big. That's going to cause redness and heat. It's also going to cause your capillaries to become more leaky. Leaky capillaries mean more fluid in your tissues, which mean more swelling. That's also going to attract more white blood cells to the area that says, hey, there has been damage here. We need some help. Again, if you're going to increase the permeability of your capillaries, then the capillaries are going to become more leaky and they're going to be leaking extra fluid out into your tissues. We call that exudate. This is going out into the tissues, and it's going to contain clotting factors and even antibodies in it, and it's going to cause that local swelling. And the term for swelling is edema. That swelling is going to push on nerves. That's going to cause pain. You're also going to get some pain from bacterial toxins, prostaglandins, and kinins. Now, if you take any kind of medication that is a pain inhibitor, like aspirin, for example, aspirin inhibits prostaglandins. This is why it is effective at pain relief, because prostaglandins cause that pain. So any kind of medication that's inhibiting any of those chemicals helps with pain relief. Now, as soon as you increase the amount of fluid in your tissues, now the pressure in your tissues goes up, and now your lymphatic vessels are going to be taking up more fluid. So remember in chapter 20, we talked about how lymphatic vessels pick up that extra leaked fluid from your tissues. Normally it's kind of sporadic, but anytime you're leaking extra fluid into your tissues and the pressure in your tissues goes up, you're going to be pulling way more fluid through your lymphatic vessels. That is also helpful because I want you to think about cells that live in your lymphatic system. Lymphocytes. Those are your third line of defense. So now remember back in chapter 20, we talked about how when you pull up tissue fluid and it's moving through your lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes, you've got these white blood cells that live in your lymph nodes and they're patrolling the area. So as things move by, they say, hey, that doesn't belong. So this is a great way for your white blood cells to recognize something foreign. You also get some clotting proteins and complement proteins in that area. And remember, your clotting factors are going to form that fibrin mesh. So they form that spider web looking structure. This is going to help to isolate the injured area so that if you do have an active infection right there, it stays isolated to that one spot. Now, strep bacteria, they have the ability to break down a blood clot. This is why when you get strep and you look in the back of your throat, what do you see when you get strep throat? It's red. A lot of times you'll see red dots everywhere, and it's where the bacteria have broken down the clots in there. Okay, you're bleeding into those little areas. So this is the inflammatory response. So it's everything that we just talked about, but in a flow chart. So let's do it again from sort of this visual. So you can see here, you've damaged your tissue. First thing that's going to happen is any tissue cells that have been damaged, they're going to start to release inflammatory chemicals. So this is going to include things like histamine, complement proteins, prostaglandins. All of those are inflammatory chemicals. And it's going to cause all of these things to happen. Arterioles are going to dilate. They're going to get bigger. This is going to cause you to get more blood flow into the area. This is going to lead to heat and redness. Those are the first two things that we see with inflammation, right? It's going to cause those capillaries to also increase their permeability. They are leakier. This is going to cause you to get more fluid in your tissues. This is going to lead to pain and swelling and possible impairment of function. That's going to help you heal. You're also going to get a lot of white blood cells moving to the area to help clean up and gobble up any kind of foreign organisms that might have gotten in at that wound. Okay, so this is everything that we talked about. It's just more in a flow chart. I also want to mention a little bit about the phagocytic cells that we find within the inflammatory response. So during the inflammatory response, phagocytic cells will gobble up foreign organisms that might have gotten in, especially if you've damaged a tissue. So the steps that are required for phagocytic cells to become mobilized and start gobbling up. The first one is leukocytosis. This means that you are basically going to be making more white blood cells. You're going to be releasing neutrophils from your bone marrow in response to the injured tissue. You're going to pump out white blood cells. Well, how do those white blood cells know where to go? How do they know where the tissue has been damaged? Let's say you cut your finger. How do those white blood cells, when they get in circulation, know to go to your finger? They know because that inflamed area, remember those damaged cells, let's say it's at the tip of your finger, they're releasing chemicals that call for those white blood cells. So as the white blood cells get out into that area, they go through something called margination. It means they cling to the margin walls of that capillary in the inflamed area. Then they're going to squeeze out through the capillary wall through a process called diapedesis. That term literally means to squeeze through. And then they're going to get out into the tissue by following those chemicals. And that's called chemotaxis. They're following those inflammatory chemicals like a homing device. And they're finding where that damaged site is. And they're going to clean and gobble up foreign organisms. So this is a great picture that's showing you those steps for mobilizing phagocytic cells like white blood cells. So you can see here, you damaged your tissue. Maybe you've stepped on a nail. You are going to go through leukocytosis and make extra white blood cells, and you pump those out into circulation. How do they know where to go? Because this tissue is swollen. Okay, so these white blood cells you can see here, as they are moving through that capillary, they're going to cling to the wall of the capillary. That's called margination. They're going to squeeze through the wall of the capillary. That's called diapedesis. And then they're going to follow all those little blue chemicals out here. Those are inflammatory chemicals. They're going to follow those chemicals, and that's how they know where to go. Okay? And they're going to start gobbling up any bacteria or foreign organisms that got in the area. Now, sometimes if you have really damaged your tissue, you're going to see pus. Okay, and pus is basically dead white blood cells that have died fighting infection, dead infectious cells, foreign cells. It's also going to be tissue cells that have died or been damaged, and pathogens. All of that is found in pus. And a lot of times, if the pus isn't removed, if it doesn't drain out of the wound, then it's going to get walled off by collagen fibers. Collagen fibers, if you remember from Anatomy 1, they are stronger than steel. A piece of collagen and a piece of steel of the same diameter, collagen is 1,000 times stronger than that piece of steel. They're incredibly tough. So y'all remember the your rat with that pustule in the intestines? I was cutting through it and it was really tough to cut through. This is exactly what happened. It got an infection in that area and it walled it off with collagen fibers. So cutting through those collagen fibers was really tough. And basically it forms an abscess. And an abscess is basically this giant pustule. And it will have to be surgically drained. So you have to cut it, you have to drain all of that pus out, pack it, and let it heal from the inside out. Now we also have, other than the inflammatory response, we also have what are called antimicrobial proteins. And these are going to be proteins, again, we're in our second line of defense, that include things like interferons. These are my favorite. Of all of the second line of defense, I think these are the most amazing proteins that we have. Interferons prevent a microbe from reproducing. I'm going to show you some pictures of these. And then we also have complement proteins. Complement proteins will attack a foreign organism directly. Okay, so let's start off with interferons. I think I like these because the name just makes perfect sense. They interfere with microbial replication. Typically what happens in your body is if a virus gets into your body, remember, viruses are not living things. This is why we can't fight a viral infection with antibiotics. I want you to think about that term right up here, antibiotic. Now let's break that down. Anti means against, and bio means life. An antibiotic will kill off living things, right? Bacteria, those are living things. Viruses are not. So if you have a viral infection, antibiotics do nothing for you. Antibiotics do not touch viruses because they're not living. In order for a virus to reproduce, it has to infect you. It has to get into one of your body cells, and it has to take over the DNA of your body cell. Then it tells that cell to pump out more viruses, and your cell will start producing more viruses. The cell will die. When it dies, it releases a ton of viruses that then do the same thing to other cells in the body. This is how viral replication works, just very easy. What interferons do is that the minute a body cell is infected with a virus, a body cell, that cell knows it's gonna die. That cell knows it's being taken over by a virus. It's gonna have to start making viruses, and it's eventually just gonna die. So that cell sends out chemicals called interferons to all the neighboring cells around it. And those interferons block viral reproduction in the neighboring cells. So this is how a cell that's getting ready to die in your body can save all the surrounding cells. I think that's pretty fascinating. So here's a picture of that. You can see this at the top. This is our host cell. This is a body cell. You can see that pink virus has gotten into that body cell. It's going to take over that cell and start pumping out more viruses. That cell's going to die. So that cell releases interferon. And you can see that the interferon chemicals go to nearby cells that have not been invaded yet. And it actually activates an enzyme. So there's enzymes inside that cell. So that when the virus tries to infect this cell, the activated enzyme prevents it from replicating. So the virus is unable to multiply in that cell. So that's an interferon. It's literally chemicals that interfere with viral replication. This is actually a drug that we give patients who are HIV positive. We give them interferon. It's actually going to help prevent HIV from infecting other helper T cells in the body. Okay? So this is something we can use as a medication, but it's also something that we find naturally in our body. So I mentioned this just a second ago. Genetically engineered interferons can be used to treat some viruses. Anything from genital warts, which are viruses, hepatitis C, even some forms of leukemia. Then we also have, again, in our second line of defense, we also have complement proteins. These are proteins we find in the blood. There's about 20 blood proteins that are classified as complement proteins. And they're always in your blood in an inactive form. And their job is that they're going to help to kill off bacteria and cells that do not belong by causing the cell to lyse open. They're basically going to punch holes in that cell. So complement proteins, they play a role in the innate defenses, but they also play a role in the adaptive defenses. So you'll see that as we talk about that next week or on Thursday. In order for, again, I mentioned we have about 20 complement proteins in the blood. It takes about 5 complement proteins to come together and form something called a membrane attack complex. For short, we call it MAC. And the MAC is sort of like a giant hole punch. It is 5 proteins that are sort of situated like a giant hole. Here's a picture. You can see these 5 proteins. And they're going to punch a hole in that foreign cell. They're going to punch a hole in the plasma membrane. So it embeds in the plasma membrane. And if you have a cell that now has a giant hole in it, water is going to move in and out. And typically what's going to happen is water is going to flush into that cell very quickly, and it's going to cause the cell to burst open. Also, if complement proteins are activated, it's also going to stimulate mast cells and basophils to start releasing histamine. It's also going to attract neutrophils, so other white blood cells, to the area to help fight off the infection. And then the last of our second line of defense that I'm going to walk you through is fever. So fever is an abnormally high body temperature. This is in response to getting a microorganism in your body. White blood cells like leukocytes and macrophages, if they see a foreign organism, if they're exposed to a foreign organism, they will secrete a chemical called pyrogens. Remember pyro, think fire, pyrotechnics, pyromaniac. Pyrogens, these chemicals actually are now going to be in the blood and they go to the brain. You have two areas of the brain that do not have a blood-brain barrier. Okay, so areas in places like the medulla oblongata and the hypothalamus. There's no blood-brain barrier because these maintain homeostasis. If those areas see pyrogens, those are also the areas that set your body's thermostat. So pyrogens basically go to the brain and they tell the brain, hey, normally we should be at 98.6, but there are pyrogens in here. So now we need to set the temperature at 103. This is why when your body releases pyrogens like this, right when you first start running a fever, how do you feel? Cold, freezing, like give me every blanket because I can't stop shivering. I am so cold, right? And the reason is you're shivering. What does shivering do? It causes your body temperature to go up. And so by shivering, this is going to help to raise your body temperature even faster because you basically have just adjusted your thermostat. You changed your thermostat from 98.6 maybe to 103. So you're going to shiver and warm yourself up, okay? And by doing this, pyrogens, by raising your body temperature, you are taking what normally maybe some foreign organisms might love 98.6. That's the temperature they want. But when you raise the temperature, you now make it an inhospitable environment for a lot of microbes, and they can't survive that high temperature. And so by raising the temperature, you're killing them off. So in reality, a fever is actually a good thing. It's helping to kill off bacteria. It is also going to help the liver and the spleen pull up iron and zinc. These are two things that microbes need to divide. Well, if your liver and spleen pull them out of circulation, guess what microbes can't do? They can't divide. They can't go through replication. So another thing is high temperature increases your metabolic rate. This is going to help you heal faster. So having a moderately high body temperature is actually a good thing. It helps to prevent bacteria from replicating. It's also going to promote healing. So like my child, if he runs a temperature of like, a low grade fever, 99, 100, 101, if it's during the day where I can monitor his fever, I do not medicate for his fever. I will let it ride. Now, before he goes to bed at night, I will medicate because I cannot monitor his fever. And a high fever is dangerous. Too high of a body temperature can actually denature proteins. Remember, proteins are folded. Think of hemoglobin, right? The globin chains. They're these big folds. They look like a hot mess, but the fold is there for a reason. And if it unfolds, we call that denaturing, and the protein doesn't work anymore if it denatures. What are proteins in the body? Hemoglobin is a protein. Antibodies are proteins. There's a whole lot of proteins in the body that are really important. So if your body temperature gets too high and proteins start unfolding, you will die. So body temperature of like 107, this is when they start packing ice around your pulse points, like under your armpits and around your head and in your groin. We got to get that temperature lower. So this is why I say during the day, if I can monitor my child, I'll let the fever ride, as long as he's not uncomfortable or in pain. But at night, I always medicate a fever because I'm not right there with them. Okay. So low-grade fevers can be helpful. So remember, we have these innate defenses. So I'm going to pull up a whiteboard real quick. So our innate defenses, these are not specific. Okay. These are going after anything that doesn't belong. Our first line of defense is basically the skin and your membranes, okay? So your first line of defense keeps the outside out and the inside in. It's also going to include the chemicals that are being released from your skin, right? Like the acid mantle. Our second line of defense is a whole host of different things. Again, not specific. If something makes it through your skin, we have phagocytic cells to help gobble up foreign organisms. We have pyrogens to help you run a fever. We have interferons to help prevent viruses from replicating. We have natural killer cells to gobble up foreign organisms. So we have the inflammatory response. And this is just to name a few, right? So we have all of these things in the second line of defense. Again, not specific. It's just if it makes it through your skin, here are all the ways that we can fight off these different foreign organisms that make it past that first line of defense. And again, remember, especially with the inflammatory response, if that one's activated, it's also activating our third line of defense, which is our adaptive defenses. Those are specific. They are targeting very particular foreign organisms. And so that is what we'll pick up with on Thursday, is we'll start walking through our adaptive defenses, the specific defenses. This is what you think of when you think of your immune system. Okay, you're not thinking of your skin. You're not thinking of pyrogens running a fever. You're thinking of this, okay?